Hello and welcome everyone live and direct to Republica TV. My name is Yolanda Rother. I'm part of the Republica team, and I am so honored that today we have with us Richard Sennett. He is a professor of sociology at the London School of Economics. He's a former university professor of humanities at NYU, and he is a senior fellow at the Center on Capitalism and Society at Columbia University. Richard, we have you here from London, I understand, and it is wonderful that you are joining us. This has been made possible through the Federal Foreign Office of Germany. And without further introduction, I would just like to welcome you here with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
So let's get straight into this discussion that we don't have so much time for it. But the first question is going to be around the assumption that green cities are also healthy cities. So we've been under the assumption that green cities, meaning environmentally sustainable transportation systems, for instance, that encourage a certain sense of density to result in some type of hyper-efficiency. Density, however, is leading to potential health ramifications and is obviously going against the physical distancing. So it would be interesting to learn from you if that means that green city and healthy cities stand in direct contradiction to one another.
I don't think so. I should say that I work actually for the United Nations. I've not been at either Columbia or at the London School of Economics for 5 years.
Okay.
But at the United Nations, I had a task force on exactly this problem, which is how to reconcile and work through the relationship between making a city green and making it healthy. And you've identified exactly the problem that exists, which in one way, which is how to manage. And for instance, we know in public transport, the more people we can get onto public transport and out of automobiles, the greener it is, and the more danger they have of falling sick. So we are looking at various aspects of this. We're looking at the complicated problem because density isn't just a condition. You have in Manhattan a super density, and there you've got a real problem. But if you can spread it in the city, so you can walk to centers which are dense, which is what the mayor of Paris wants to do, then, this 15-minute idea that she has, then you can get people to walk or cycle to places which have the advantages of density. That's a possibility, in other words, to decenter density, if you like, which is so that people don't have to go to one place to do that. That, however, is something which is a solution for privileged places like Berlin, New York, or Paris. In the city, most of the cities we work with in the UN, where people live in barrios or favelas, are hours away from their work, which are in factories or far away in the center of the city. And there's no way that they're going to be able to walk to 15-minute cities. So for them, it's a kind of economic problem. How much can we take apart the industrial economies of those cities and decenter them so that they're closer to where people live? And that requires a change in capitalism rather than a change in transport planning. The other thing that we're doing I'm sorry to give you a long answer to this question, but I've been working on it for years now. The other thing we're looking at is how to have flexible forms of housing so that in times which are not pandemic times, you can push modules of housing close together. And when people need to separate, you can separate the housing in different modules that you can pull it apart. And that, curiously enough, is something that the global South is able to deal with more than, say, like Berlin, which has pretty much a rigid built environment. There's no way that you can really deal with a kind of accordion way of housing people when there's a pandemic. It may be that we'll find ways of adapting for the global North, ways to keep cities in flexible forms so that when people need to be apart, they can be, but it's not permanent. The great danger in all of this is that we'll redesign cities to be permanently the way they are in this crisis, right? That is, they'll be designed as though panic is normal, and there'll never be a vaccine. There'll never be changes in the way public health is conducted, and so on. And it's a problem because it's a great temptation for the powers that be to take emergencies like that and make permanent the arrangements that suit emergency. In New York, for instance, after 9/11, all the housing regulation, all the building regulations were to build skyscrapers, which could be proof against airplanes being flown into them. And it took about a decade to get these, as though no building would ever fall over if a 747 went into it again. And, it's the same kind of problem with the pandemic, that you could make permanent, for instance, ways of controlling people by use of high-tech face recognition technology and other things like that.
Yeah, great.
Which you might want to use now, but you'd want to turn off after the moment the pandemic passes. But, the powers that be, once you give a government a power, it's very difficult for it to say, okay, I stop now. I give back my power. It's very unlikely to do that.
Thank you for that. On the topic of surveillance, I'd love to hear your opinion. So since the advent of the pandemic, there has been explorations with geolocation tracking, health monitoring apps, corona tracing, as you've said, face recognition. Just these past days, we've been exploring an app here in Germany, which would identify and interview every person who's been tested positive and find every person that they've been in touch with. And some countries have been using such apps, and they've been having surprising results come from them, actually. It's even been almost the critical mode to fight the pandemic. So, cheek and tongue question, but what actually speaks against implementing high-tech surveillance measures?
Well, you have to distinguish, I think, between surveillance measures and information gathering measures. These apps are used in China, for instance, as a way of taking control of population generally. They're not turned off, and the information quality of it is subordinate to the notion of who's there. There are lots of ways that you can design. The technology is not the issue, it's the power using it. There are lots of ways to use apps like this, which do a good job in tracing people, but then are trashed or shut off after that job has been done.
Mm.
The problem in a place like the United States is, would you really believe the Trump government? You say, well, we're just collecting data. Well, we won't store this. The CIA won't keep this. It's the same. It's a Chinese problem. So, but it's not a technology problem. It's a power problem, which is how you use how you use data gathering. And I think it's going to be a real issue for us in certainly in Britain, and I imagine in Germany as well, about who actually has control of this information. Is it a government? Is it a hospital? Who is it where owns the central processing unit? So I'm not dodging your question. I'm just saying it's sort of putting on the technology, which is really a question about politics.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've been talking about the surveillance capitalism anyway, and I think you also, in a previous interview, were speaking about digital slavery. This, what you're discussing, these power dynamics and just systemic power structures in our society, of course, those are all things that will play into it. I would be curious if you can give your best case scenario, however, for the use of surveillance and where the power could lie.
Well, I hate that word surveillance as an equivalent for tech. One of the things that I think has been great in Britain, and I don't know if this is true in Germany, is that through high-tech means like Zoom and other sorts of communications devices, people who were completely isolated now have neighbors. That there are self-help groups, mutual aid groups that have sprung up on the internet, which never existed before. For Saskia and me, for instance, we're the highest risk category, and people are constantly in touch with us online. People we've never known before. So I think the notion that what'll come out of this is a threat, that is the threat of surveillance, overlooks a lot of good uses of technology, social uses of technology. And for us, that's particularly important. And of course, you Germans are all so admirable about these things. But for us Brits, that's important because the safety net of the welfare state in Britain is very fragile. Mm-hmm. That is, there's very little that the state does to put people who are older or people who are isolated in contact with somebody else. They essentially wait until people have to go into nursing homes, which is the very end of their life, for instance, to deal with elderly people. So this high tech for us has meant that we're able to create a kind of strength in civil society, which our conservative regimes, our neoliberal regimes, have been taking apart for the last decade. And so, that's why I bridle at the notion that high tech equals surveillance. It doesn't have to. It shouldn't.
Thank you for that answer. And yeah, of course, there's definitely a large added value in using all of these technological means. So it was more just trying to understand what your take is on surveillance. In terms of vigilance, though, you did have a recent interview in the Berlin Tagesspiegel that basically called for citizens to become more vigilant. And I'm wondering if that's also in a form, or what your take is on legitimizing informal neighborhood watches, reporting to the police. I recently saw a post on basically how if you're out with more than two people, you're basically asked to report that back to the police. And I'm wondering what your take is on how that's going to transform our culture of trust and solidarity between the self and stranger.
Well, report back to whom?
To the police.
Have a problem.
Yeah.
Here, that couldn't happen. That's a problem. That's where the state is, where power is taking over the functions of what is meant to be care to actually exert a kind of hegemonic control. So the problem is they shouldn't be reporting to the police. They should be saying, if your neighbor sees 5 people hanging out at a pub, which is shut, the neighbor should intervene. They shouldn't be calling the police.
Mm. All right, and
that's the difference between civil. When you have a strong civil society, people don't say, "Oh my God, they're breaking the law. I'm going to call somebody who might put them in jail or fine them." Just say, "Stop doing it." I mean, think of the analogy with little kids. If you saw little kids spray painting a graffiti on the side of a wall, would your impulse be to call the police or tell them to stop? If your impulse is to call the police, you have no civil society.
Mm.
If your impulse is to go up and say, stop it, that's a more citizen-like behavior than phoning the cops. I think you've understood something about me, which is that I am rather an old-fashioned communitarian, a very old-fashioned one. And the thing that I really reproach to the modern left is that the notion for them that for a lot of left-wing thinking is that regulation is the road to justice. And that's not true. I mean, the road to justice is made by social interactions. And when you think, I don't want to get involved, I'll call the cops, you have already become, whether you're left ideologically at the far left as you want to be, you have ceased to be a citizen. You've become an agent of the state. So I think, and that's one thing that I hope will come out of this. I'm sure Germany, it's not a problem. But in countries like the US and the UK, where the state doesn't really have any effective way of dealing with the crisis, you've had a resurgence of civil society, faute de mieux. Do you know what I mean? Because there is no wealth, there's no safety net. That might be a good thing, because if those social ties remain, that comes out of this horrible event.
And that is also, in one way or another, urban resilience that comes out of that. So
it is. Our favorite UN word.
Fantastic. But yeah, digging a little bit further into the role of the social state. We really see that coronavirus is revealing a lot of dysfunctionalities of the system. It's bringing up the economic inequalities, ecological destructions, pervasive power dynamics, which we've already spoken about. And there's like a new urgency that has come out through this to discuss political and economic ideas, such as universal basic income or governmental interventions to house the homeless, as well as the discussion around state surveillance on individual activity. And the question is, do you believe that this will change the attitude on the idea around the self-regulating market, i.e. neoliberalism? And I'm guessing the answer will be yes. And how will that be changed?
You've asked me a lot of questions all at once. What I'd say in the background to this and it's something that I think has been very bad in the press, has been that this is a real serious crisis. And the way you deal with serious crises is not to stir up panic. It's been a kind of juicy piece of meat. I don't know if this is true in Germany, but certainly in the States and in Britain, that this juicy piece of meat is every day there is the reporting is all focused on the fact that we've never seen anything like this before. Our whole lives are going to change. It's out of our power to do something. And if you panic people, their response is going to be very self-destructive. In military, for instance, if you say to people, "My God, you're under attack," if people panic, they're pretty certain to die. In civil society, if you stir up a lot of panic, you're going to get people who will say anything, I'm so scared, I can't manage it, I can't do anything. Take me in your hands, control me, you know? So my feeling about this, and this is very specific to the US and the UK, is that what we need to do is be fairly cool-headed about this, that the whole aesthetics of panic really play into power relations. And so I think that's a background of this. I don't think everything will never be this, everything is going to change and be different. This is a problem, and it's a really horrible problem, and it's a problem we'll solve one way or another. And there are good things to be learned from it, like this, social networking. That's a good thing that's going to come out of this. There are also dangers from it. But the more this is kind of the idea that this is transformed society, the more pacifying you create as citizenry. So I'm really resistant to that. I think it's going to be, in terms of where we started this interview, we're going to have to do a lot of experiment with density. And we're going to have to make trade-offs between looking at, well, let me put it another way. There's always a trade-off between risk and security. If you want to be 100% secure, you should move to North Korea. There's always has to be a trade-off between a certain measure of what's imponderable, what might be hurtful, and so on, and that kind of risk, and the notion that you're an actor in society. So this is something, just to bring this back down to the ground a bit. In the work we're doing, the UN work we're doing on social distancing, we're looking at where does the phenomenon of, it's actually physical distancing, become so destructive to people's economic lives that there should be the risk of occasional encounters of reducing at certain moments physical distance should be taken. And that's a very specific question. Probably not in a sports stadium, but maybe in a factory, It's also a question about how to rebuild differently, If you wanted to build an absolutely risk-free hospital, people would enter the door and nobody would ever see them again until they were cured. We can't build hospitals like that, particularly in the global South. So what I feel about this is that this has got to be a very specific discussion about how much risk we're willing to take. And that means it's the pandemic in that way is not different from other kinds of tests that people have. We all take physical risks that we can't manage, and emotional risks where we do something we are not certain how it's going to come out. But the notion that that's why I say that's to deal with practical questions of that balance between risk and security means we've got to get out of the mindset of thinking everything has changed. Life will never be the same after this pandemic. It was devastating. We couldn't manage, and that's basically a way of becoming a slave, in my view.
Very interesting perspective. Thank you so much for that. We're moving to the final question, which is that we're also seeing a shift in the public space. Of course, we're seeing dead public spaces, abandoned streets, empty areas. There's a mourning, the loss of public life as we know it, and a lot of the public life is now taking place online. Just the other day, I heard you, however, say that you're delighted to watch a theater piece online because it even it creates a different type of intimacy. But so my question is, what opportunity do you see in making the public space online become more accessible and more inclusive? And does it even potentially have an equalizing effect?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me the other side of this question, which is how in physical space do we get the sociability that comes with density? How can we recover physical space? And some of that, anyhow, I'll answer that question, and then I'll try and answer your other question.
Okay.
But your first question I know something about, which is that one of the things that I think will come out of this experience is that most public spaces now are co-opted by tourists in big cities. I don't have to explain this to you in Venice. If we cut down the reliance of cities on tourists, those public spaces could still be used, but they would be much less dense in this way. It would be a good thing in general if urban economies were weaned off of mass tourism. But some of the studies we've done about this are that in non-tourist areas, you get rather more, you get healthier forms of density because you don't have people packed in those masses of people congregating in one center. For you, in Berlin, that might mean that Savigny-Platz is a viable public space, but that these huge tourist sites in the center, like Potsdamer Platz and so on, they should leave tourists. They should not be allowed to colonize those spaces. So I'm sort of speaking ironically about this, but it's a serious point. The densities that we know are densities of essentially invasion by tourists. And one of the things that we're looking at is how to find, we're doing this in London as a case study, how to find ways of sociable density which are non-touristic and how they work. And they seem to work our pub culture will have to change, but the open public spaces seem to work pretty well.
Thank you.
And that's really important. And that's important in the developing world too, because, there has to be a way of managing density, which is a key to sociability in cities.
Fantastic.
You know that.
Thank you so much.
Anyhow, that's what's really on my.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. So thank you so much, Richard Sennett, all the way in London. Thank you for being a part of Republica TV, and hope to see you very soon again. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.